Now let's begin here in Nigeria for analysis of yet another distressing attack in the northwest of the country. On Monday, gunmen ambushed a bus in Sokoto state and 30 of the passengers ended up not being kidnapped, not being taken away or even shot, but being burnt to death. Some of the passengers survived with severe burns and are in hospital. The area where the attack took place is described as increasingly lawless, with a great deal of kidnappings carried out by bandits. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now in the studio by the defense and security analyst, Dr. Kabiru Adamu, who's also the CEO of the West African security firm Beacon Consulting. Thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you, Charles. Good evening.
First of all, just tell us what we know so far about this dreadful attack. I mean, what details have emerged, do you know?
Yeah, so there appear to have been economic migrants who were traveling from one part of, possibly from Niger actually, and then maybe a few of them from Sokoto with the intention of traveling to Kaduna and then thereafter to some parts of southern Nigeria. And so in between Sabon Birni and then Isa local government as well as Shinkafi local government, they encountered this gunmen around 10 a.m. in the morning, and this gunmen opened fire on the bus they were traveling in. Apparently after that the bus had an accident, or we're not sure what happened, but then the vehicle caught fire, and it appears two conflicting reports. One says a few of them may have survived that particular incident, while the other report says all of them were killed. That report said the bandits surrounded the bus and ensured that all of them were killed by the fire. The other report, which seemed to be what the police is throwing out there, is that about six persons survived the incident and that they were taken to the hospital. Unfortunately, a few of them may have died. What we haven't had is whether they've been debriefed to now give an account of what actually happened. But then definitely there was an incident like that. People died. Unfortunately, the exact number, it's not clear. We're hearing figures of between 10 to 50, depending on which report you go with.
And of course, part of the problem in that area is a sort of paucity of communication services. So it's very difficult for information to trickle out, which is why we're hearing it today when it actually happened yesterday morning.
Exactly. Even though it must be stated that Sokoto State was the first state out of the 4 states in northwestern Nigeria that announced the lifting of those extraordinary measures that were imposed by the 4 state governments in September of this year. For some reason, Sokoto reviewed its implementation of those measures and decided that those measures had to be reviewed, and so it lifted the suspension of the communication network within the local government that had been affected. Incidentally, this particular location, the travel route between Sabon Birni and Isa, was one of the travel routes that the government had said there wouldn't be any movement at the time it implemented those extraordinary measures earlier on, unfortunately.
So that was clearly identified as a very dangerous area.
Exactly. And so it begs the question, for instance, the security arrangement within the location. Why didn't it take this into consideration? Again, this happened in the early morning hours, around 10 a.m. from the reports we're hearing. And so it begs the question, where were the security agencies when this happened? So
a pretty horrific incident. I understand that the victims included children, and that many of them, I mean, we saw photos, which we obviously can't show on television, many of them were burnt beyond recognition. How unusual, assuming that thread of the story becomes the, what actually happened, how unusual is it for bandits to set fire to the victims in this way?
Very unusual. However, if we go a few weeks back, you recall the incident that happened in Goronyo. Now, both Goronyo and Sabon Birni are within the same senatorial district, what is popularly called Eastern Sokoto. Now, that incident in Goronyo, you recall they attacked Goronyo around 4 p.m., surrounded the town, and opened fire and killed, indiscriminately, including women and children. And I mean, till today, the exact figure of the persons that were killed in that particular incident has never been verified, starting from 70 to around 100. So there has been a history of that type of bestiality by bandits operating within Sokoto. Now, there is a theory out there saying that perhaps because of the current security force operations that are ongoing within the Northwest that may have blocked their supply channels, the intensity of this bestiality may have increased of recent, so perhaps suggesting why they would do something like that.
We're talking about theories. This sort of tactic is more likely to be associated with insurgents rather than bandits. I mean, I was reading somewhere that it is possible that it may have been carried out by Boko Haram or ISWAP rather than bandits, and I'd be keen to get your take on that, because even though Boko Haram and ISWAP usually operate in the northeast of the country, there is some suggestion that they're kind of expanding because this sort of thing just is not associated with banditry.
Yep, but increasingly we're seeing that type of, it's not logical. You cannot explain the type of,
the motivation, right?
Exactly, that would lead to this level of destruction by the bandits. Bandits usually are driven by, pecuniary motives. In this instance, perhaps the initial intention was to stop them, rob them, or abduct them. But then when that didn't happen, they ended up killing them. So that is something that cannot be explained. Again, there is a deep-rooted, I would say, grievance that is driving these bandits. And that is where people like Sheikh Gumi's explanation of these issues come into play, in the sense that they're angry about certain occurrences within the location, and so they are meting out that anger on residents, irrespective of whether they randomly whether they participated in what happened or not. So perhaps that is what is leading to all of this. But the reality is that there is a thin line between the bandits that are operating currently in the northwest and in the northeast. There are enough indications that has told us the bandits have been confronted, or they have been, the northeast terrorists have reached out to the bandits in the northwest, and whether that relationship has been formalized or not, and it remains to, time would tell. But there is some form of communication between the two groups.
Yes, because I mean there are strong reports about, as you said, a very thin line between criminality and terrorism. And the reports are suggesting that there's some sort of alliance between the insurgents and the armed gangs that are behind the kidnappings in the northwest. And it would make sense, wouldn't it? Because even the insurgents need money, and they kidnap people for ransom. But the northwest, an increasingly lawless region, we've known this for a while. This latest attack clearly putting the authorities once again under the spotlight. What are they saying about the security and the safety of people in the north? How are they fighting back?
So, if we speak about Sokoto specifically, like I said earlier on, the governor did join the other, 3 governors in the region to implement those extraordinary measures that affected GSM communications within some local government. He shut down some markets, banned movement on certain routes, created certain committees. He has a commissioner for security. In the past, it used to be a special advisor, but he elevated that position to that of a commissioner. So clearly, he's trying to do state-level arrangements to address these issues. But again, the lacuna in our constitution that prevents governors from having armed security is a challenge to him. So even where these gaps are identified, he has to rely on the federal security departments to deploy. And where they don't deploy, then unfortunately this kind of incidents would happen. And it's not really too difficult to identify why. The military is stretched. The last time the Chief of Defense Staff briefed us on this, he said the military is deployed in 34 states. And we're talking about a military that has a strength of less than 200,000 deployed in 34 states of the Federation, 774 local governments or thereabouts. about. So clearly there are gaps within the security architecture that these bandits, non-state actors, are exploiting to carry out this type of incidences that we're seeing.
Right. And how is all this affecting the lives of ordinary people? I mean, that's a fairly obvious question. I mean, clearly life has been severely disrupted, perhaps even shattered for many years now in that region. Thousands have fled, many have relocated. Life has been disrupted, but the insecurity is continuing.
Exactly. There is a significant portion of Nigerians that have been forced out of their homes and that are currently living as refugees in Niger from this local government that we're discussing. And so livelihood has been severely disrupted in most of these local governments. The few that have remained, unfortunately, have had to pay some form of levies or taxes to the bandits just to continue living and operating there. The others that are still living there are living in between the bandits, as it were, and government authorities. So unfortunately, the circumstance of those locations are extremely worrisome in the sense that the structure of governance that should protect people is almost completely missing in some of those locations. And I mentioned, like at the beginning, these are local governments in Sokoto East. We're not just talking of one local government, we're talking of about 4 or 5 local governments, unfortunately.
And we've got less than a minute. This past weekend, reports emerged that the army killed nearly 50 of the armed criminals, but it's not stopping the banditry, and the general perception still seems to be that the authorities don't have this under control.
Yes, the figures are clearly. We're going to release our November report.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that.
in a few days.
Right.
And that report would show the number is almost around the 600 figure that we've been reporting monthly. So if you, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, almost about 10,000 Nigerians have been killed by non-state actors, terrorists, and these bandits. So unfortunately, yes, the efforts are there, but the efforts are not good enough. People are still dying, unfortunately. And again, I mentioned the lacuna within our constitution, where the federal government has absolute control, as it were, over armed security.
Right, and that's a problem.
Exactly.
Okay. Dr. Kabiru Adamu, who is also the CEO of the security firm Beacon Consulting. We're looking forward to that report.
And I'll share it with you.
Thank you very much indeed.